Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to meet somebody new. This is someone that's going to be working with us at the Cycling 74 Expo. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to her ahead of time. Her name's Dr. Kate Sicchio, and an amazing body of work, which we're going to cover a lot in this discussion. So I'm just going to start off by saying hi. Hey, Kate, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to have this chat. I know that you, I mean, I look at your list of work and the stuff on your website, and I'm just like, busy person. So I'm just glad that you were able to take some time out to have a chat. For people that aren't familiar with your work, why don't we have you start off by talking a little bit about what your work looks like and how you engage in different artwork?
Sure. I guess currently my art practice has sort of two areas. One is choreography. That's my main area of practice. I identify as a choreographer. That's usually what I tell people. But the other area of practice is I do work with audiovisual, and I'm in an audiovisual laptop band called Cody. And both of these practices currently involve live coding, but I've also worked with a lot of different ways of basically engaging technology and performance in some sort of fashion.
Right. Now, I think it's just really interesting, all the different things that you're into that sort of like tweak my curiosity a lot. First of all, your work as a choreographer, it's interesting you say you identify as a choreographer, because that's also, I think, how the world identifies you when you're brought into projects and stuff. They treat you as sort of a dancer choreographer. And I saw some video where you actually were working with, I don't know, do they call it NISI?
The New York Hall of Science,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Where they had you working with scientists for some specific practices and stuff like that. You're actually really taking advantage of this opportunity to kind of work with people outside that tight confines of choreography, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the NISI project was really great in that I was working with, she's actually a mathematician slash biologist. Like she makes these incredible math models of cells, and they wanted an art piece to sort of, yeah, dialogue with her work. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a really fantastic project where I got to like learn a bunch of about this kind of biology that I really hadn't had experience with,
Yeah,
and then
right.
get to jump in and try to interpret that as an artist. So yeah, that project for sure, I was able to like come in as a choreographer and really dig into something, a different field, and yeah, apply sort of these different approaches that I've gathered over the years to something completely new. Yeah.
So generally speaking, my experience is that people in, well, I would say people in a lot of the arts really have kind of almost either a stress reaction or a fear reaction when they come into contact with science and math and those kind of things. I almost feel like at some point we had sort of like the personal choice to say, I'm either going to pursue science or I'm going to pursue art, and there's no looking back, right? You
Right.
seem to have found a way to personally cope with that. And I'm curious about your background, because one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background. But as a practitioner, both of coding and live coding practice, as well as the sort of like almost dark arts of choreography and dance, I think that I can only imagine that your background holds some interesting keys to a story, right? I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you got to be the artist that you are, and what were the influences that brought both the technological or technology side as well as the dance side into your life.
Yeah, I think it starts way back, of course. So I've danced basically my entire life. You know, my mom put me in, baby tap and ballet when I was like a toddler. I was probably started at 3 or 4 dancing, and it was something that she just thought was a hobby and an activity for me to do as a child.
Mm-hmm.
I started to get really serious about dance probably when I became a teenager, and it was something that I knew I was going to continue with, and I really saw it as my creative outlet, particularly choreography. I like discovered making dances as a teenager, and that was like really became my like I'm like I know I can do this. I'm good at this. And but also at the same time, I always had a keen interest in technology, and we had the internet very early in our household. And so one of the first things I started doing was making my own websites, and I taught myself HTML. And my first job was actually at a web startup as an intern, and they would give me huge Photoshop files, and I'd have to cut them up and make them into HTML. That was my first job.
Sure.
So I always had these two things, but they didn't come together until I was in college. So I did my undergrad. I went to do a BFA in dance, and then I actually got injured halfway through the program. So there was a 6 month period where I couldn't dance, and I had several surgeries during that period. It was pretty, yeah, like definitely no movement was happening. So
Hmm.
I had to figure out how to fill up my college schedule, and so I wouldn't have to take off like a whole semester or a year even. So I went to the multimedia department in the university, and I was like, I know HTML. What classes can I take? And they just turned around and said, anything. What do you want to take? So I started taking classes in that department. And then when I was well enough to dance again, someone actually said to me, you could do both of these things. And I'm sure they just meant like for my schedule or my timetable or whatever, like courses in both departments, but that's not what I heard. Right? I heard, oh yeah, why don't I try to put these things together? So that's yeah, the second half of my undergrad, that's became my main focus was like taking classes in both departments and trying to make them fit together somehow. So yeah, very early in my undergrad, I figured this out. Like this is something that I'm interested in. And so following that, I went to do my graduate work in the UK. So I left right away after my undergrad to do a master's because I found this program doesn't exist anymore, but it was called digital performance. And I was just like, this is what I'm doing. Like it has a name now. So yeah, so I ended up going to the UK to study, and I ended up teaching there and going on to do a PhD. So I was there for 10 years.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Um, yeah. So I think one of the things that happened was my master's programs in the UK are very short. They're like 1 year. And I just discovered this thing, and then I did it for like a year, and then I was like, I have so many more questions. I have to keep going. So that's when I engaged in the PhD, and I'm still like, I feel like I have this like lifelong question of like, how does technology and dance go together, and like, what does that mean, and like, how many ways can I explore this? And I don't think I've found a good answer, which is why I keep making work, because like making the work is a way of exploring that question and trying to figure it out.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that unfound answer in a way that seems like kind of core to how a lot of artists end up really finding the thing that they can sink their teeth into, because it's that process of like finding an answer that actually feels fulfilling. You're for yourself. You're trying to find an answer, and that has a deeper meaning, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I think it's kind of funny that you use sort of like this selective hearing to turn yourself into a combination. Uh, to be able to embrace both the technology and the art side. What were some of the first things that you did that sort of touched on that? Where were your what were your first sort of like artistic technology efforts?
Yeah, I worked a lot with video in the beginning. And so putting video projection into performance became like a really key thing for me. That's what my PhD looks at is real-time video projection in live choreography. And I think for a long time that was like what I was interested in because I really love visual aesthetics. I was really interested in like why so many times putting video projection in live performance doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
You're all of a sudden like the dancer and the physical performers are like battling with this thing that's been added to the piece, and it's a lot of times I think we're so drawn to screens that it's so easy to pull the audience away from live performers by putting a screen in the space. So like, yeah, all my early stuff is around trying to figure out those relationships and how to make them work better. And that I focused on that for like a very long time until I would say the last I've gone away from that more recently. So one of the ways I really focused on creating that relationship between the performers and a projection in the space was using real-time visuals. So having dancers tracked by cameras in the space and then having that somehow create the visual that's in the projection.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done a lot of things with, different kind of like optical flow systems that make it look kind of painterly and responsive in the projection. So I did that for a long time. And then I was using security cameras, like CCTV cameras, and putting lenses on them. My whole PhD uses that kind of camera. And then, of course, when I finished, the Connect came out.
Mm.
It made that like 100% like way easier. Like I didn't have to like go and find these weird lenses and tape them together. And now it was available for at the time $100. Now it's like 20 on eBay,
Right.
right? But I was like struggling to get that to work for years, and then it was there. But when the Connect came out, this idea of recoding it and hacking it actually became the more interesting thing to me. And so by hacking the Connect, that opened up like this whole other area of work for me. And that's where I really dove into more the coding side and doing things with choreographic coding and live coding became a huge part of my practice. And that's kind of, through the Connect and then not using it.
Right.
Ended up in this place of making dances with code.
You have sort of embraced the phrase hacking, where uh, a number of the pieces or the works that you have on your website, you have hacking choreography, hacking the body. Hacking as sort of a concept is something that you have latched onto as sort of a focal point for your work. And I was actually fascinated by some of the ways that you express that. The earliest video I saw, which was hacking choreography, was really kind of interesting because what you did was you just sort of used a pseudo language on screen that the dancers were following.
Mm-hmm.
And as a viewer, it pointed out so many things that I guess I would have intellectually known, but I never felt, which is the idea of choreography as being, on one hand, sort of a set of instructions and ones that can be managed through a almost programmatic level of repetition and conditional statements or whatever. But also there's a significant part of it that is still remains in the interpretive hands of the dancer.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really interesting that with a few simple commands that you typed into this on-screen projection and that the dancers were watching, the sort of like variety that occurred with that. And it was remarkable because on a programmatic standpoint, it's almost the opposite of what a computer does, right? If you give the computer some very small number of statements, it'll do a very small thing for a short period of time, right? Where what that pointed out is that if you give a dancer a small number of statements and an opportunity to do them, they can create something personal even with that. And I thought that was kind of a brilliant thing where a bit of simplicity really revealed a lot about choreography. I thought that was amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the pseudocode piece is one of my favorite that I've made, and I think it really opened up this idea of like, so in that piece, I'm using dance improvisation as sort of the way. So it's not a set choreography,
Mm-hmm.
but um, but yeah, the score is being developed in real time, and there is like a pseudo language to the score. So there is a sort of setting up these movements, and then giving the dancers conditionals in ways to like then explore those movements. Yeah, I think there's like a lot of play with that idea of agency and highlighting that the dancers have to make these decisions and highlighting that they're thinking dancers. So that's like another thing that comes up a lot in my work is that there's a cognitive labor that you witness on stage when you're programming a dancer. Use programming loosely, but that you don't often see in choreography, right? A lot of times dance is about making it look easy on stage,
Right.
making it look like they're just, there's not a thought process there. But I'm sort of like exploiting that there is one and making, I do purposely make it get more difficult, the instructions as they go. And there's moments where you really see them like, they stop and they look and, they have that moment of like, how do I do this next?
Right. Yeah. Or what was it that the other was supposed person was doing that I was supposed to be watching for or whatever. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how some very simple instructional changes actually end up making a very complex sort of arrangement, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm always curious about this. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with the dance company for a while, and I really enjoyed it. But they had a very stable group of dancers and who came to really understand the choreographer very well.
Mhm.
What is the process of doing that? How do you find, first of all, dancers that are going to be willing to go on whatever weird intellectual journey you're going to take them on? And how do you help them understand what's in your mind so that they can help implement it? I'm used to working kind of on my own weird plane of thoughts, right? And to have to actually express them in a useful way to other people would be kind of difficult in some cases. You don't have a choice when you're working with a dancer, and I'm wondering what you do to kind of communicate your interests and understandings and kind of ideas in a way that's going to be valuable.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing, and because I work with several different dancers, so each one I think I have a different way of communicating with. But when I look for a dancer to work with, the main thing is they have to have strong improvisational skills. Like they have to be willing to really explore like their mostly their body and language, because a lot of the scores are textual. Although my more recent work has been using images instead. So I've had like a few dancers, particularly in the UK, that have done a lot of work with me. They sort of like now they see it and understand the pathways they can take, and they've kind of developed their own systems for interpreting the scores. But that didn't come right away. So like, there's one dancer who I've worked with quite a bit in the UK, who we had a 1 week residency to develop a piece with another artist, Nick Rothwell, and we were making a generative score that's projected on the floor of the space, and it's textual. And like, she definitely was not happy about the text at first, and she was really struggling with that. So we like spent a whole day just coming up with the words we might use within that,
Mm-hmm.
and then developing like workshopping those words to make sure they were rich enough to develop different movement vocabularies. But even then, she was really struggling with sort of like, we had this whole animation where the words would come in and they were set up visually, the words, to kind of look like trees and children. The programming side was all done in Closure. So we wanted it to kind of look like that, like Closure or like a Lisp. But it took her a long time to like understand like the first section is the movement, and then the next section of words that come in are like qualities that she can add in, and then the next one is body parts actually comes in terms of words. So like she was just seeing them all kind of come and being lost in that. So we added these like little play bars on the side, these little red stripes, and they kind of just look purely aesthetic, but that was actually a way for her to be indicated that the next, like that part is going to run up and the next part of the system is going to start.
Oh, of course. Okay.
Like, that process was super interesting in terms of like we really had to find ways for her to find a system of going through the score. So that was like a really great sort of collaborative work with the dancer in terms of like, yeah, I have all these ideas, but in order to make them legible, we had to add these little things to the piece.
To make them legible, but also to give the dancers something to latch on to. That's an interesting point, and I hadn't thought about that. But unlike, especially if it's against a set musical or a set video piece, but even in even in something that's more improvisational, there's still this idea that I can sort of like cue people up for the beginning of the next movement or whatever. When you're dealing just with a flow of text, that kind of thing isn't necessarily, or maybe we're not like emotionally set up to see text as being like a setup for the next for a movement, right?
Right.
And so that had to be probably pretty disconcerting. It's interesting to think about that as being one of the complexities you had to find a way around.
And it's funny because I've worked with that dancer on other scores that aren't textual, like been able to just dive in and work on it. So we also, the same dancer and I did a duet where we basically put little vibrating motors like in your cell phone in a shirt,
Right.
and basically I would buzz right or left and then lots of different patterns. She loved that. That was like her favorite thing because it was completely a sensation, and it was like she just would run with it. It was so easy for her. And then another thing she did in that piece, which I actually loved, was sometimes she would ignore the like signals I was sending
Yeah.
because she had found an interesting thing that she wanted to go off and explore, like in her body. And then yeah, she would come back and refine like this, like what I was sending, but she would ignore me sometimes. And I was just like, oh, this is so perfect because yeah, she should be making these decisions, and like I have to readjust now, and I have to recalibrate what I'm
Right.
my score in order, because and it became a jam that way.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds very much like a duet rather than a conductor performer kind of orientation. It sounds very much more like a duet.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that and felt like that was, yeah, a really lovely approach. And part of that was, yeah, because she wasn't reading this time, because it was all purely sensation on her body, she was so comfortable to go and do that.
Hmm. Yeah, I have to say that sometimes, especially in a performance environment, I my inner fascist tends to want to take over. It would be really hard if they like ignored me to just not like repeatedly bang that button until they do it.
Oh yeah, I totally did that sometimes. I was like, I'm saying right, I'm saying right, but
Now, but this brings up another part of your work, which is sort of like wearable technology. And that's another area that you explore pretty deeply. In addition to sort of these vibrators, you also did some stuff with sensors as well, right?
yeah, yeah. So in my PhD program, I met this other woman, Camille Baker, and we do our wearables and performance work together, usually under the banner of hacking the body. And there's several different ways we've done this, but we've done a lot of work with both making our own sensors and then hacking commercial devices to use those sensors. So one of the pieces that we made with our own wearables, we collaborated with another engineer, Becky Stewart, and a fashion designer, Tara Booth Mooney, and we kind of made this shoulder piece that's actually a soft sensor. So it's pleated, as it's like a sleeve that's pleated, and every pleat is actually a sensor. And so they control two things in the performance. It's a duet, so each dancer has a shoulder piece. So it does control sound, and like I'm trying to remember how many pleats there are. I think there might be 10 pleats, but each one has a slightly different sound to it. And then the other thing, if you touch any of the pleats, each dancer has a little tiny motor on their neck. It's really tiny little servo, and it has a ribbon tied to it. and it literally tickles their neck.
Mm.
So the dancers send these tickles to each other while they're moving, and that becomes actually what they have to keep exploring and going through. And it is like this really it does startle you, but it's still gentle because it was like we have all these haptics that vibrate, but they're all like they can be quite harsh. And if you're wearing them for a long time, actually you can start to like feel a little tingly or like feel like you become numb to it, you know?
Right.
So this was like, how do we find a haptic that's like gentle and subtle, but still gets the result? So we, yeah, tied these ribbons to motors to make that happen.
I think that's an amazing insight. First of all, if the dancers are responding to the sounds that happen when they touch something, their response to that is going to be sort of oriented towards making more sound or making different sound. And it's also the person who is like pushing the sensor that's going to respond. By having sort of like this tickler thing, it also means that the recipient of the touch is going to have a response, and it's a response to physical rather than audible stuff. That seems like it builds a lot of complexity again into a relatively simple interaction.
Yeah, and then exactly, and then they also like we give them rules to how to interact during the piece.
Okay.
Yeah, at first they're just touching the sensors with their hands. And then there's a section where they're not allowed to use their hands, so they have to activate it with different body parts. And then they activate it also with each other, like another section. So they have to send the signal to the other person, they're actually touching that person, and then they get this tickle as like a residue almost, or like another response. So yeah, we keep building on that. And so yeah, this really simple thing, you touch this, you feel the ribbon becomes a choreographic device.
Right.
And I started thinking of it as in terms of like interaction design as choreography, right? Because like you figure out all these ways you can interact with this one sensor, and that begins to shape the piece.
Well, that actually leads into what my next question was going to be, which is when you're doing something like this, how do you make it be a an artwork or a dance piece and not a technology demo? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, because it's got to be tempting at first to just be like, let me show what each one of these pleats does, and let me show each one of the sounds we can do. And in fact, that can take away from it being an artistic expression and just turning it into a tech demo.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the challenges I think within this work for sure. I think a long time ago, I kind of gave up on being like people have to understand what's going on. Like it's about the process. Like somehow this technology is aiding my creative process.
Mm-hmm.
Letting go of that has helped a lot in terms of not making the demo. Because like once you are like the audience has to know that the sensor is making the ribbon go, then you have to show exactly what that's doing in the beginning. And yeah, you can build from there, but it becomes this like I touch this happens, and you get a lot of one-to-one mappings that way, which I think are super boring.
Yeah.
I think giving myself permission to not have the audience in on it has really helped with that, particularly in terms of work with sensors, because that really frees that up, and it's just about making the piece. And then a lot of times my work is billed on art tech events, so people know there's some kind of aspect to it where the technology is involved. And there's usually some kind of like question and answer with audience afterwards where, all will be revealed. But in the piece, I don't feel the need to like let it be really clear for the audience.
Okay.
I'm okay with it being a bit ambiguous.
Have you found that audiences have changed at all? I mean, have they become more sophisticated or not really?
It depends. I think there are actually, I would say like a lot of them know a lot more interactive art. Like a lot of them, have moved in front of a Connect at an installation, right? They all know to wave their arms. It's a really common thing. Some of them have like really figured it out that, oh, when there's interactive work, that means I'm looking for relationships. I think they're getting there, the audience.
So now kind of going further, you talked about sort of like a second leg of your artwork, which is doing live coding with this project called Cody. Fill us in a little bit about what that is.
Sure. So my live coding came out of choreographing and developing different ways of live coding dances. And the live coding community really embraced me right away. And I've been a pretty active member of that community for many years now. But the majority of that community makes music.
Hmm.
Very, I think there's two other people who really code dance in the way I do. So I know them well. We get together. But
Table for three.
right, like the main sort of way live coders work is they're making music or sound, and a lot of times it's in nightclubs. They do these nights called algo raves.
Hmm.
I started organizing algo raves in New York for the other live coders I knew, but I wasn't really performing at them. The first couple algo raves we organized, I did some things for the audience where I'd like give them instructions and try to live code the audience
Uh-huh.
in a sort of nightclub way, like or like in between acts, I would like live code them, like give them instructions to like go buy beer and that kind of thing. But I really wanted to actually perform in that environment, so it made sense to start making music and sound.
Hmm.
And the other part of that was I actually had begun at the time I was teaching at a music middle school in New York. They had a like enrichment creative tech class, and so I was teaching them Sonic Pi so they could live code music. And the kids actually had their own algorave. They like made their middle school dance into an algorave. So I knew how to do it. I just hadn't done it in adult algorave yet.
Hmm.
So I think I performed twice solo, and then my friend Sarah was making compilers for visuals and live coding all these visuals, but just doing it as a process to make visuals. She
Okay.
wasn't doing it as a performance practice yet. She was really interested in like particularly for front end development, how to like make that pipeline shorter.
Okay.
So she was developing a live coding language just for design purposes. And I was like, you can perform that. Like, you can come do visuals for me. So she agreed, and after one show, she was hooked. So we formed Cody. So it started with the two of us for a couple months, and then when I make sound, I work a lot with samples,
Hmm.
and I really wanted to somehow expand that kind of sound and somehow play with this idea of the sampling. So we knew another female composer, Melody, and the first couple times she played with us, I would send her, I would live sample something I was doing, send it to her, she would mess it up, and then send it back. And basically, she would like create these new samples live, and I would put them back in. So we started performing as a trio like that for quite a while. Now, because I've moved to Virginia for my new job, we like there's always two of us playing, but we sometimes still play as a trio, but usually it's two of us in some formation playing. But there's this real connection to the visual, and that's sort of what has created our aesthetic, I guess. Is there's this use of samples and loops to make dance music, but there's a real clear connection to the visual. And I think what's also interesting about that is the connection is like I would say aesthetic rather than like linking everything and making it sync. So like
Right.
uses SVG files, so they're like circles and polygons and lines, and like she builds them up over the set. And we do the same. We start with like simple beeps and boops and build those up over the set. So that's what brings it together in a really coherent way. Yeah, so the way we sync the actual visual with the audio is quite simple. Sarah always starts with a blinking circle, and then we start one of the beeping samples, and we do it by just watching it, so it's eyeballed. I see the rate at which it's going, and I hit play, and that's the only time we sync the audio and the visual is that first moment. And then from then on, the audience's brain does all the syncing because her frame rate is pretty much equivalent to like 120 BPMs. But we don't have to like send messages to sync the video, visual, and the audio. Everyone thinks it's synced, but that's just because that's your perception of it.
Yeah, the brain is a pattern matching tool, right? It's really amazing how you can get away with murder with some of that stuff.
Yeah, that first sync, and then the rest of it is just us layering samples to make dance music.
That's interesting. Now, one of the things I would say is that that sounds pretty unique in my experience with the live coding world, because oftentimes live coders want to display their code on the screen while they're performing, which actually would sort of like point to what you did with your hacking the choreography stuff, except in this role, you don't do it because you have a visual artist that's actually putting up visuals for you, right?
So sometimes we still show the code, but we usually have to do that through like a second projector or a second thing that's off to the side.
Okay.
Sarah also has a little like column on the side showing her code. So we do respect that part of live coding, the show us your screens part. When I work with Melody, sometimes, yeah, when there's two of us doing the sound, sometimes we like pick who's gonna show their sound code for that performance. But we're actually looking at a new way of basically using the same environment but on different laptops, so we can then project both of our codes at the same time. So that's going to be a future development for us because there is something nice about that. I think particularly in the algorave environments when you're in a nightclub and you walk in and there's just code everywhere. It's so
Right.
bizarre and beautiful, like and out of place and great. Yeah.
Well, it sort of sets a tone for what you're into as well. That's for sure. There are a lot of tools that people use for live coding. I've mostly seen people either using like Chuck or Title Cycles, I guess it's now called. What do you use, and what do the other people in Cody use as their performance tools?
So I use in Cody, I use Sonic Pi,
Okay.
and so does Melody. And Sarah has a custom coding language she made called La Habra. So it's closure script based, and it runs in an Electron app. So she completely created her own language that you can find on GitHub. I have been using title cycles actually for my latest dance piece. So in it's called Moving Patterns, the work, and I've been using not only for the sound, but a friend of mine, Tom Murphy, made a little library where I can pattern images, just like you would the samples and titles. And I've been using that as a way of creating choreography. So I've been using, we'd call it Dance Dirt, our little library, because in title cycles, there's Super Dirt is the way it talks to Super Collider. So we have Dance Dirt. So I've been using title cycles to make choreography, actually.
Interesting. That's pretty wild. And when is it that you're going to be doing performances with that?
So we just performed last week in Madrid at the International Conference on Live Coding. And then I'm hoping to do another piece with that probably around March time. I'm hoping somewhere here in Virginia. And that's all that's lined up for that. I'm also working on, so one of the things that's come out of that using title cycles specifically is that I've just like, a lot of the terminology is more, it's not musical, but it's more musical. So like there's times when you type in like reverse or
Hmm.
that kind of thing. And I was like, oh, I really want this to be dance language. Like, I really want it to be like I'm typing instructions like I'd be saying to a dancer in the studio. So I'm now making my own language. So it patterns images like I was doing in title cycles, but the actual syntax is more geared towards dance. So instead of saying reverse, it says retrograde.
Right.
And it's interesting because like, yes, it could be read by a dancer and they could perform it kind of like the pseudocode. but I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it for me because I want to feel like have that choreographic language in the coding. This new language and the piece using it is going to premiere in May in the UK at the Festival of Algorithmic and Mechanical Movement.
Um, so is that's the Algomech festival thing that Alex McLean does, right?
Correct. Yeah.
That has really kind of blown up in a way I think that he never expected, and I think a lot of people would be surprised by. What is it that draws you to that world?
The world of which world?
Well, yeah, good point. Good question, right? I would say that algorithmic seems sort of almost the opposite of choreographic in that you're, but maybe it doesn't have to seem that way, and maybe I just need to wrap my head around differently. What is it about all of this world, the world of sort of like the technological drive and the technological connection to art? What is it about that you're drawn to, and why is that? I guess why do you think that that's become the nature of your work?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm interested right now is this idea of the computer or the technology not just augmenting the performance, but somehow really interjecting into the process. So instead of just making a video projection that goes behind the dancer, I really want the technology to somehow be involved in the actual creation of the work. And I wonder if, in some way, this will give us new possibilities. So I think as a choreographer, it does change up how I compose movement and how I put things together. So algorithms are a way of doing that, giving us new procedures and giving us, more opportunities to explore rather than going back into like my habitual like, and now we'll do this section and now we'll do this section. And so it's a way of breaking that up. And that's what currently is like really interesting to me is finding new pathways by using the computer and algorithms. And yeah, sometimes not getting what I expect out of the computer in terms of ordering movement. So yeah, that's like can become a really interesting way of using the tech is finding things I wouldn't think of.
How much do you worry about, or worry is probably the wrong word, how much do you consider balancing the new and the algorithmic with sort of some of the traits of performance that we sort of expect and actually have come to sort of have become signals of how a performance works. You know, what does an introduction sound like? How do we have a refrain, or how do we have closure at the end of a piece or at the end of a movement? What do you end up having to do in order to balance those things, or do you not worry about it?
Yeah, no, I think there is a structure for this to like exist in terms of a performance framework, and that can vary. A lot of this kind of work builds over time. This is like there's definitely like a simple beginning, and a lot of that's for everyone to like adjust to, like the performer, the coder, or the audience, and then it builds and builds and builds as it loops, kind of thing. So like that's become like a major framework for this kind of work. I do feel like that's become, if you see a lot of live coding, it does become like expected and maybe kind of boring that everyone starts at the same place and has to build up. And there's a lot of opinions about that, if you need a blank slate or if you can start with something else and change it. So I think currently I do that. I start with, you know, with nothing and then I change it as I go. But there's definitely room for starting with a full piece and then deconstructing it and yeah, exploring new structures within that. The other thing I do in terms of like structuring it as a performance piece is usually I have set time limits because like, yeah, you could technically do this, you know, until everyone's tired and hungry, right? You could go for hours, like because there's a human component to my work that the computer doesn't have to deal with, right? Which also I find interesting that the computer can keep spitting out instructions if you let it. but the people will get tired. So yeah, so like a lot of my work is framed in these traditional like 20 minutes. It's like what we usually see as a performance now if you're on a shared bill, for example. So like I'll use that 20 minutes as like the way of framing it.
Sure. Well, Kate, I want to thank you for this time. This has been eye-opening and very helpful for me, just as I kind of consider the varieties of ways to think about performance and technology and structuring things. It's very useful to consider that. I really appreciate that. But with that, I'm going to have to let you go because our time is up. So I want to thank you very much and wish you a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and yeah, letting me talk about my work.
It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Okay. We'll catch you again soon at the expo, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see you there.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thanks so much to Kate for having that great talk. It was a lot of fun getting caught up with her, finding a little bit more about her practice. Really interesting stuff. If you get a chance to see her in action, please go out of your way to do it. It'd be worthwhile. As I mentioned, Kate's going to actually be at the Cycling 74 Expo that I too am going to be at. If you're into it, check it out. The expo is an educational and a social event for some Max users, and it's taking place for 3 full days in late April. You'll be inspired by the presenters, plus you can meet me, my coworkers, a lot of other Max users. You can get more details on the cycling74.com website if you're interested. I want to thank you for listening and ask you to keep on sharing this with your friends. It's just really encouraging, the amount of listenership that we have right now. Really makes me feel great. Thank you so much, and we will catch you next time around. Bye.